Hi there, welcome to the channel. My name's Steve. I create security videos about historic breaches and what happened and what we can learn from them. And today I'm going to talk about a wild supply chain compromise from late 2023. Now, supply chains for a long time have been highlighted as a big risk for lots of organizations. We have this increasing dependency on suppliers, and whilst doing our own security is one thing, being able to review and enforce security standards for third parties is increasingly challenging. And in late 2023, a number of organizations found out about those challenges with a supply chain breach at the identity provider Okta. As always, I'll talk about what happened and what we can learn from this. But first, if you find this content useful, it really helps me if you like it or comment on it, and even better if you subscribe. Right, let's get into it. So what happened? So in September and October 2023, the companies BeyondTrust, 1Password and Cloudflare all detected suspicious activity in their systems, which they traced back to a compromise at Okta. And they all detected this in slightly different ways. And if you're not familiar with Okta, they're an identity provider. So they store identities, roles, groups. When you log into cloud services, they can control that logins, they can operate single sign-on for you, enforce MFA, and do a bunch of really useful, not just IT administration tasks, but also security tasks as well. And attackers love targeting these because if you can compromise an identity provider and start controlling identity, you can do massive damage to an organization. So the organization 1Password were the first to identify that there is a security issue within their environment, which they then traced back to Okta. And if you're not familiar with 1Password, they make password managers. And the way 1Password first identified that there's an issue is that one of their admins received an email, an automated email from Okta to say that they had generated a report in their admin portal, but the administrator knew that they hadn't done that, and they raised the alarm to security. The 1Password security team then identified that the Okta admin account was being accessed from a suspicious IP address and then started responding to that. So as part of their investigation, 1Password identified that the compromised account, so the account the hacker was using, well, the owner of that account, who I imagine was an administrator at 1Password, well, at some point before the hacker started using it, and they don't say when, but at some point before, the owner had uploaded a HAR or HAR file to the Okta support portal. HAR files are HTML archives. I'll talk about those a bit later on, but they're central to this story and they're going to come up again. And if you want to learn more about how 1Password discovered this compromise and what actions they took, they've written a really detailed blog about this, and I'll leave a link to it in the description of this video. So if that 1Password activity had begun at the end of September, well, in early October, the security company BeyondTrust also started detecting suspicious activity in the Okta admin portal. Now, BeyondTrust had blocked this activity because they had configured their Okta tenant to block things that were, I guess, out of the ordinary. They don't go into detail about how they did this, but I guess they had a good sense of where administrators will be logging in from and were putting controls to prevent anything suspicious happening. So although BeyondTrust had done a great job in configuring Okta to prevent these suspicious logins on the Okta web portal, they also have an API. So Okta have an application programming interface. That's where you can programmatically interact with services. And those configurations that BeyondTrust had done on the Okta web portal, well, they weren't able to apply the same ones to the API. It just wasn't an option in Okta at the time. So the attacker used the API and was able to generate a backdoor account. So they could create a new account within the Okta tenant that BeyondTrust had, and they could use that for follow-up access. So as part of their investigation, BeyondTrust identified that 30 minutes before the compromise began, before the hacker had control of this account, the owner, I guess an administrator at BeyondTrust, had uploaded a HAR file, I mentioned those earlier, to the Okta support portal. And we can start to see this pattern emerging that this breach was linked to these HAR or HAR files. And those HAR files are central to this story, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So the final victim that we know about was the organization Cloudflare. And on the 18th of October 2023, they started to identify some suspicious activity in their Okta tenant. Now, In their blog, they say they responded really quickly and they eradicated the attacker and shut down the access. However, and I totally sympathize here because instant response is really, really difficult. It's tough to always know what an attacker had access to and what accounts you need to rotate and what systems you need to rebuild. And eradication really is very, very difficult. So if we fast forward now to November 2023 and Cloudflare have identified that a self-hosted Atlassian server of theirs has been compromised, and they've linked that back to their October breach at Okta. And it turns out that in their response to the October breach, they rotated hundreds of credentials, but they'd missed 4 accounts. One of those was a service token, 3 of them were service accounts, and I guess it was one of those that the hacker could then use to access their Atlassian setup. Now, Atlassian is used to store things like source code, bug reports, and other useful information like documentation, for example, that an attacker would find really useful if they wanted to further attack Cloudflare and dig their way into their systems. And service accounts are also really interesting. Traditionally, they're only used programmatically, so in scripts or to interact with APIs or something of that nature. And often, certainly from my experience that I've seen, they don't have multi-factor authentication. They don't use any kind of MFA because they're not used by humans. They're used programmatically, so there's nobody to do the MFA. And in addition, they don't always have extra protections on them, like IP allow listing or some kind of linkage to a corporate device, so they can't be used outside corporate devices or the corporate network. And it's these accounts that attackers must love to get their hands on, because they also know that and know that they can get through MFA because they just probably won't have it. But Cloudflare have a couple of blogs explaining their response to the Okta compromise, then their own compromise, or the compromise that followed on from the Okta compromise. I'll share links to both of those in the description of this video. And I've got to say at this stage, hats off to 1Password, BeyondTrust and Cloudflare for the level of sharing here. It's really valuable insight for us as defenders to see inside what happens during an attack. And there's lots of great lessons from it, but I'll get onto those in a minute. So, how did this happen? So these 3 compromises, they all tie back to the compromise of one single account at Okta. And that was a service account for the Okta support system. Now, when we talk about, say, risk analysis and identifying our assets and trying to understand what's valuable to an organization, it's true, I don't think I'd often think of a support system or a ticketing tool as being really valuable or something that needs extra defense. But this breach shows how interesting those are to attackers and how they can be leveraged if they're compromised. And this all goes back to those HAR files that I mentioned earlier in the video. And those HAR files are basically dumps of data from a browser when they're accessing a website. So they're often used in troubleshooting. So if you've got an issue, say, accessing your Okta admin portal when something's not working, the support agent will often say, can you just export a HAR file for me, upload it to our portal, then I can just see what's going on with your browser. Maybe something's not loading, maybe something's missing. Now, this is where this becomes a little bit problematic. When you authenticate, you get a session token or a session cookie back as part of that authentication. And it doesn't matter if you use FIDO2, YubiKey, the world's best MFA. Post-authentication, you get the session token or session cookie, and it can basically be reused anywhere. It's your ticket to get back into that service. That gets stored in the browser, and that gets uploaded with the HAR file. So if you're the attacker and you get hold of these session cookies, you can just replay them and voila, you're past any MFA and you're into a service. So in the Okta support portal, we've got all these cases being raised. We've got the folks at Okta saying, hey, can you send me a HAR file or an HAR file? I need to understand what's happening in your browser. And their support portal, I guess, is just filling up with these files that contain these massively sensitive session cookies that are basically giving admin access to lots of organizations. And the plot thickens a little bit more here, and Okta say in their investigation, I don't think they've confirmed this, but one way that they think their support portal was compromised, or the most likely way, was due again to a service account, one of these great accounts that often don't have MFA, but it was used by an employee on an Okta laptop, but in the Chrome browser, where the employee was logged into their personal Chrome profile. Now, that meant that any passwords that are inputted into web portals were saved. That's a great feature. We talk about password managers being really useful for us and really valuable tools. But because it was saved for the user's personal profile, that would have synced up to, I guess, Google Cloud, and then maybe sync down to the machines that that employee uses, their personal machines, etc. All those good things that don't have any corporate IT on them, don't have any good security, probably don't have any good protections, and may have things on them like info stealers, other malware, or the account itself is just compromised by the hacker. And that's the chain of events here that Okta and the other organizations think it happened. And they've got very high confidence it was the HAR files that gave the session cookies. The Chrome bit, I think they're not sure, but it's one possible avenue. So you've got an employee using a service account that should never ever be used programmatically, so should never be used by a human. That would have stopped it being stored in the password manager in the first place. They use that credential whilst using the Chrome browser, which stores it to their personal Chrome profile. The attacker gets hold of it, logs into the Okta support system, browses tickets, then identifies interesting ones that have the HAR files uploaded, takes those HAR files, and then boom, they can pull out the session tokens and they're into admin sessions for lots of Okta customers. Now, in terms of the blast radius of that compromise of the support portal, Okta identified that it was 134 customers that had data accessed about them by this attacker. And of those, only 5 had HAR files taken and further access took place. So not a massive attack in many ways, arguably though very targeted, which suggests this was maybe a nation state or a very, very sophisticated criminal group who were targeting Okta specifically, and once they were in, they knew exactly what they were looking for. And just to give you a sense of scale, those 134, that's only 1% of Okta's customers. So why is this interesting? Well, to me, this is really interesting for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, it's the vulnerability we have in our supply chain and how arguably easy it was for these session tokens or cookies to be stolen from Okta to give hugely privileged access into organizations. I dread to think what would happen if this kind of attack was done by a criminal group. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but if it was, and they wanted to steal information at scale or deploy ransomware at scale, in many respects, we were lucky that obviously they targeted some pretty sophisticated organizations with what looks to be very capable security teams who were able to identify this and shut it down very quickly. And the other part I find interesting is just that chain of events where this one little service account that I'm sure when the employee was using it in their Google Chrome browser had no idea that that one account could go compromise admin access to Okta systems at massive organizations. And I think when we do our risk analysis and we identify our sensitive assets, those accounts often are kind of forgotten or maybe not recognized because they're difficult to understand. But it's a really nice wake-up call for us that even those systems like support systems, ticketing systems can be leveraged by attackers for further access. And when I think about service accounts, and maybe if you're watching this, you might be thinking the same thing, that there are lots of them out there in organizations that are too critical to rotate the password on, they're too critical to change in any way, and everyone would be very nervous about putting further controls around them. It's a good wake-up call that maybe we need to revisit that kind of thinking. So what can we learn from this? Well, I've already talked about a bunch of different things we can take away from this breach or these breaches that we can use in our own organizations. The first one that jumps out at me, and I'm sure the 3 victims we talked about, the 1Password, BeyondTrust and Cloudflare, were all using least privilege for their Okta admins, i.e. they had as few as possible. The more you have, the bigger that attack surface becomes, and arguably the more likely it is that you're going to have a problem. I would also suggest, although it's not directly related to this breach, is using tools like conditional access if you use Enter ID to control where an admin session can be created, and in addition using just-in-time admin access. So you can have an admin account but it's not got admin privileges assigned to it unless it really needs it, and users can be trained in how that works, and again that's just reducing that privileged account attack surface even further. Probably goes without saying at this point, but using things like FIDO2 or other phish-resistant MFA factors for admin accounts really is a must, considering the impact that a compromise of one of these can have. And one thing we could do that would be effective in the case of the Okta breach is to keep the session length of admin sessions as short as practically possible. Now, in the example I said earlier, one of the victims, it only took 30 minutes from when that half file was uploaded to when the attacker started exploiting it. But if your session length of an admin session is, say, 30 days, that gives a big window that an attacker can steal a session token or a cookie somehow and then reuse it in an attack. Going back to half files then, I think there's two factors here. One, we need to be more aware when we're sharing these. I generated one earlier and they're pretty big files and not that easy to sanitize. I've seen some advice online say, don't share half files unless you've removed session tokens or credentials from them. Well, that's great to say, but I skimmed through one here and it's pretty difficult to sanitize. So I think we need to be aware of that when we're doing it and really push organizations to advise us how to do that. Equally, if you run a service desk or you have a tech support team who might be requesting these from customers, you need to be aware of what's within them and help people either sanitize them or find ways where you don't have to request them. And if you do have to store them, storing them securely, because you don't want to end up like Okta, where they really were the single piece of a breach that spidered out to lots of other organizations. And the issue with the use of the Chrome profile or the personal Chrome profile by the employee at Okta. Now, you can block that in Edge and Chrome. You can say that users can't sign in to those browsers. I'm not sure, and maybe somebody can correct me in the comments, that you can restrict that to certain domains. So for example, being able to say you can sign into our browsers, but only using your corporate account. So we end up in this tricky spot where password managers are great, and we all agree on that. But if we block tools like being able to sign into Edge or Chrome using accounts or personal accounts, we lose the password manager functionality. So the answer there really is to, where you've got employees using lots of credentials, to give them proper password managers. There's lots available, and those can help control that attack surface and reduce the ability of those credentials to go to places where they definitely shouldn't be. And then I think the final lesson from this is around going back all the way to the start, where I talked about supply chain compromise, and that's third-party risk management. And it's a really, really important, but also hugely challenging area for us in security. We all would agree that we need to understand who our third parties are, what risk they are, what data are ours, or what dependency do we have on them. But to really get into the weeds, to do good security due diligence, it's super tough. We can do all the questionnaires, get all the evidence, we can enforce certain levels of standard on them. And I'm sure lots of people did that for Okta. They're a big organization and they do identity for lots of organizations as well. But clearly none of that worked to prevent something like this happening. So in the third-party world, I know it's a big issue, but I'm still lost as how we solve this problem. So that's all I've got time for today. I hope you found this video interesting. As I said, it's a really super fascinating supply chain compromise with lots of really useful lessons for us, for defenders, to understand how it happened and how we can protect against it. And sadly, I imagine attacks like these are only going to increase in volume over the next few years as attackers see them as very clever ways around our traditional controls and routes into organizations. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again next time.